Welcome, everybody. This is Tennessee State University Art and Design Department. My name is Courtney Adair Johnson, and I'm the gallery director. And I want to welcome everyone today to Art Talk with Forrest Young. So thanks, Forrest, for joining us. I'll read a short bio on you, and then we'll pass it over to you for your presentation. Kalina Sells, who's our chair and professor of graphic design, will head up the Q&A as we finish up. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or hold them to the end and we'll give you a chance to ask Forrest yourself. So Forrest Young is a design leader, educator, and speaker. Most recently, Chief Creative Officer at Wolff Olins, which was recently named Fast Company's most innovative company for design, where he led initiatives for the world's most influential companies. Prior to Wolff Olins, Forrest was ECD at West, leading design across a portfolio of early stage companies. Forrest has been a senior critic in graphic design at Yale School of Art, where he's also a distinguished alumnus. His work has received the highest design accolades, including Gold Design Lion at Canaan's and the ADC Black Cube. So I looked up ADC Black Cube earlier today and very impressive. A lot of noteworthy design going on there. So if you're not familiar with some of these organizations, I implore you to go out and look and see all of these accomplishments that Forrest has done in his career. So I'm gonna hand it over to you and you can tell us all about it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you, Kalina, and to all at TSU for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this all summer. This is one of 3 engagements I'm going to do for the entire year, and I tried to put everything I had into this presentation because I think that it was such a sincere invitation, and without further ado, I will just go ahead and start sharing the screen. What I might need to do is I might need to quit out of Zoom to allow permissions and then come back on.
Okay.
All right. So I'll be right back.
Brief intermission.
Fantastic. So this lecture is called Time Travel and Design. And as I was thinking about how to present and what to present and what would be most important if I was, a younger student in my profession, or even, a faculty member, and I was kind of grappling with a lot of the things that we're seeing in the world today and how they relate to practice, how they relate to even how you think about your work, and ultimately, how do you move forward? So I'll start with today. So I am Zooming from Los Angeles, where I recently relocated from Providence, Rhode Island. And this was a little kind of logo, if you will, of Los Angeles, the letters LA that are emblematic of the fact that you're always in traffic, that you're always driving in LA. And so I asked the question, what is driving the driver? So the A is, of course, the road. And then you have a little aerial view of a car that's, turning left and turning right. And this has been my LA experience, is getting to love the roads, but also just the sunny weather, the disposition, and all the unique kind of design sensibilities. I feel I grew up with cassette tapes, and these things probably look like alien objects to anyone, below a certain age band. But beyond just cassette tapes, I think that I grew up with a certain notion of what progress looked like. And some of these things, I think, are some of the things that we're all interested in and maybe grappling with and interrogating, even just looking at this cassette deck, right? We're reading it from left to right. We're assuming that, there's a certain way in which the tape head should spin clockwise, and all these things I think have come into question as we start to think about, a lot of these systems through a variety of perspectives and lenses. I was kind of taught that you design, for the future. You get a creative brief and you're asking yourself, I'm in a present moment and I'm trying to design for a preferable outcome, one that steers away from something that feels inevitable, which is something that we want to steer away from, into something that even might be even more plausible, more enjoyable, or ultimately there are limits of what's even possible. I think what's fascinating about, the last couple of years is that we've realized that a lot of these tools, a lot of these ways of thinking, always looking forward to the future, that the future is going to be better than the present moment. In some ways, were complete myths, that in many ways, a lot of the issues, systemic issues about how we relate to each other, the role design plays in these relationships, are what are these systems built on top of? What is this present moment inheriting? Is it inheriting a triumph? Whose triumph? A tragedy? And so I think it starts to extend the perspective of how we're designing into a longer moment. It's a wonderful depiction of, the idea of Sankofa, which I think is fascinating in the context of where traditional Western future design tools start to butt up and potentially can learn from other perspectives, and specifically the idea that the future always exists in front of you. If the future always exists in front of you, then the future that you're pursuing, the future that you're enamored with, is a kind of shiny projection, but whose projection and who's benefiting from this projection? And I love the idea that the past, your own lived experience may provide the very thing that you're seeking in this faraway future. So I love this as a reminder to essentially possibly revisit your past, and there may be something valuable that you left behind. And again, hopefully the last couple of years has created a sense of urgency about how we use and broaden our tools, our influences and perspectives about how we're even seeing the world. So LA for me, when I was, visiting LA in the 80s, was all about, Venice Beach and the expressive qualities of Venice Beach, but it was also, Oakwood and the kind of, historical Black presence that was there that, now as I revisit it, in, 2021, it's fallen on hard times, and Venice as a whole has fallen on hard times. And so a lot of these memories that I had of don't walk signs when they used to actually have letters instead of, a giant open palm, or when people were afraid of television snow on your television because you thought it was a ghost, or, the LAPD and how I was brought up to think about the LAPD, and then how, West Coast rap was then kind of like confronting LAPD. And then, all of these kind of classic stars that exist within the fabric of Los Angeles, these greats, these kind of titans. The Olympics were here, Los Angeles convened the world here in the Coliseum. But then also in that same Coliseum had Watt Stacks, right? Convene this amazing moment of celebrating Black culture, lift every voice and sing, heard in Los Angeles Coliseum. And so LA is just this incredible place of all these things, colliding and cross-pollinating. And that's how it exists, at least in my memory. Now coming back as a designer a little bit further along in my career than I was then, realizing that, there are a lot of urgent things beyond just me kind of talking about these lovely kind of nostalgic, themes. When I think about the 80s and the 70s, I think about a lot of like just really vivid, experiences from film. But specifically, I think one of the things I wanted to highlight Gene Siskel was interviewing Steven Spielberg, and on the spot, he asked Steven Spielberg basically an impossible question. He said, if you could reduce your entire body of work to one frame of a film that could explain your entire body of work, what would it be? And I think most directors would have said, they would say, well, let me come back to you and let me think on that. And Steven Spielberg said, oh, it's the boy standing in front of the door in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, because every movie that I've made deals with a glimpse of the unknowable that you'll never see. If it's, a shark that's beneath the waters, I won't show the shark. I'll just show the fin peeking through the water. If it's Schindler's List, it'll just be the girl in the red dress. That's the only kind of, a figure existing in color. And it was amazing that he had such a command over what his whole body of work represented down to a single frame. And I've always thought, when I'm giving a design presentation, I should have my one frame. And so I always keep this in mind. What is my one frame? And it's obviously something deeply personal as to why these things emerge, why we choose to see the world in a particular way. So I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with the movie Blade Runner. And of course, coming back to Los Angeles in September 2021, it's just funny you're kind of confronted with all these things that exist in your mind, both your nostalgia, your memories, and also your memories that come from science fiction and dystopian fiction. But then I also realized that, everything feels currently apocalyptic. We have tremendous forest fires. We have hurricanes and Cat 3 storms that are brewing. It really feels like everything is on the most fragile of fault lines, and even things that felt eternally permanent, like the theme building in LAX, feels like at any moment we could lose all of these things. At any moment, the Forum could be buried beneath, like a sea of sand, or even the Hollywood sign. That even these icons and fixtures that we think exist forever in our minds, in many ways, feel like everything is momentarily perilous. Even something humorous like the giant Randy's donut. So what about my frame? What is the ask is for me to reflect on my body of work and to communicate beyond just the kind of the artifice of the work. What drove me to create this work, and ultimately, are there any learnings on the other side and kind of questions at the end of this where we can kind of interrogate what are your decisions about why do you make what you make, how you make it, and who you make it for or with. So I grew up in a household that had a lot of Jet magazines, and one of the amazing things I didn't realize or just think about, thinking about, some of the great art directors, the Herbert Temples and the folks that existed within kind of the Chicago design scene, is design takes a lot of audacity. It is an audacious profession. It is ridiculous to assume that we can design things that are mass produced, seen everywhere, even if they may be ephemeral. It's incredibly bold. It takes a lot of courage to do this, and specifically to do it in a way where you feel like it represents your voice, but it authentically represents the voice of the content that you're communicating. And I didn't realize that all of these jets that were piling up in, the basket of my house, my dad actually shot he actually was a photographer for Jet magazine. So like, this was like one of those things like, oh, wow, like, my dad shot this. So it was one of these magazines that I didn't realize it was just amazingly designed, by Black folks. And I was like, my goodness, like, I didn't even realize at the time that I was being inundated with just phenomenal graphic design inspiration at the time that was being written, authored, funded, produced, designed, the whole thing, closed circle, Jet magazine. And in thinking about my one frame, my mother worked, not surprisingly, but maybe surprising to her at the time, while she was working on her dissertation, she ended up working at the Atari Cambridge Research Laboratory, meaning that as she was thinking about systemic issues of education and access to education and teacher ed. She was also thinking about the roles that computers would play in how people could think about designing their own curriculums, designing their own images of themselves, their own avatars. This was an avatar that she made for the turtle, which was the central vehicle of this language called Logo. And this was her drawing a person. And what I realized in going back through all of my work is that this was such a fundamental building block of how I would forever perceive design, which is that there's something that exists, the turtle. You're trying to reskin the turtle in a way that's authentic to the turtle, but also expresses your voice. You have the constraints of some type of grid or some type of, graphic infrastructure. And then on that, you're trying to create something fresh that surprises you, that delights someone. And ultimately, this is almost like a meditation of pixels, right? And what's fascinating about the word pixel is that the word pixel, even though it seems like it's a super original word, is actually a mashup of two words. A pixel means picture element, and it was shortened to pixel. And it's the idea that you are inserting a picture into an elemental structure in which it wasn't originally designed for. So a pixel in some ways is very guerrilla, right? It's saying that this grid of rectangles has no business having a human figure in it, but that through my intention, I can choose to have these cells be pictographic. And to me, that was inspirational. I would later do a lot of type sketching at scale, choosing to see tiles as pixels and understanding the relationship between, does a pixel actually have a true scale, or is a pixel just a framework of how you can understand how the world can essentially be an interface? And if the world can be an interface, we can start to look at, maybe historical folks that may have been overlooked, like Matthew Henson. And this was a partnership that I did with a sculptor, Tavares Strawn, who said, I want to become Matthew Henson. Matthew Henson, the unsung hero of the exploration for the North Pole, made famous by Admiral Perry. And there's always the question, if somebody is planting a flag, somebody is taking that picture, and the person taking the picture of the person planting the flag, that's the question. That's where the question should start. Who's taking the picture of the person with the flag? And ultimately, whether it's Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary on Mount Everest, or whether it's Admiral Perry and Matthew Henson, most things are usually a collaborative effort. Most things are usually a team effort, even if there's somebody who's standing atop. In deciding how I could assist this artist as he was going to the North Pole, he asked if he could have a flag that he could plant. And there's maybe the whole question of should anybody even be planting flags, period. But I thought, well, this is an interesting idea, similar to the pixel, where we can take the flag of Admiral Perry, which is a P with a bend and a star. And essentially this has been kind of invaded by the Bahamian colorway. And then the T is exchanged for a P. So this is Tavares's flag as he made up to the North Pole to take a 5-ton block of ice and deliver it to the Bahamas. In thinking about new forms of identity structures and systems, this was an identity for the Yale Women in Architecture. How do you start to treat crevices, ravines, overlooked spaces, opportunities to become luminous surfaces where actually color and vibration can happen in the most unlikely places, even if it isn't in the highest percentages? Does identity need to be something emblematic as a word mark or a symbolic mark? In creating a poster that initially was supposed to be for Nelson Mandela's 95th birthday, and it was part of a celebration of studios in and around South Africa. When his health worsened and we realized that we were going to lose him, it was the question of could we make something commemorative, and is it even right to take a kind of a birthday celebration idea and extended it into something commemorative. And one of the things that I realized was that Mandela was a boxer, and he always used boxing metaphors to talk about how you exist in the ring defines your character. And so thinking about that idea of the ring, this was actually the footprint of his cell in Robben Island. And the idea was that the A2 poster could fold out to be the exact footprint of his place of confinement, and the idea that he was never defeated, and it was a source of illumination. He illuminated the world from an 8-foot cell. And again, this idea of wrestling with pixels and where do pixels and typography and letter forms intersect, from pure geometries to things that are legible as an N, E, X, and T, and ultimately, can pixels bend and fold? And how do we start to think of them in the context of time-based media? And so again, thinking back to the humble beginnings in a graduate school bathroom, working with vinyl on tiles, you start to see that these experiments of looking at tiling infrastructure and pixels come together as a way to think about the Cartoon Network, not just as a checkerboard, but as a 4-dimensional grid of all these tiles, allowing all these worlds to cohabitate. It's exciting. So, I'm on an airplane and I see somebody watching Cartoon Network, and it's like, oh my goodness, it's like all the way back to my mom's pixels. But it's those types of things that I think you have to give yourself credit that your own lived experience is special and beautiful. And even the things that you think are strange about your experience or how you see the world are ultimately the things that can provide the key to create a way of making stuff that is uniquely yours. So this ended up producing cubed cars and bizarrely squarish skyscrapers in the world of the Cartoon Network. And so over time, I've designed for both, the established and the new. I usually can't go two paces without seeing something that I've had, some hand in developing or doing. I think that one of the things that's always misleading for any kind of project, design project, experiential project, is that it's always so misleading that you just see a logo or you just see a graphic or a poster, when these were tremendous journeys, tremendous collaborations, and bringing together different minds to be able to pull these things off, from the Cartoon Network to a lot of these. So I'll go through a couple of these projects. I think it's important just to see the through line of, just like Spielberg had a frame that talked about his unique perspective on The Boy in the Door, my unique perspective of thinking about, the pixel and the limits of the pixel, and how that moves through a lot of these projects that, may not be the lead story. And so part of what the pixel introduced for me is the pixel that I inherited was static, right? It was essentially a square or rectangle within a particular grid. But as I was experiencing a lot of these design briefs, realizing design is ever expanding. Design is how something looks, sounds, speaks, behaves, smells. It's becoming synesthetic. It's becoming something that's almost uncategorizable as a single sense modality. It's just a question of, when is something in interaction? When is something a sound? When is something, a voice? And thinking about, designing, against the world's largest television, which happens to be an AT&T Stadium. How do you think about typography existing on this type of scale? Or the yellow pages, something that I think I grew up sitting on as a baby chair booster, or tripping over as a door stopper, and realizing that, this same yellow pages that I grew up with, this is an opportunity to try to reimagine it as a shorthand for done. And if it was a shorthand for done, it wouldn't mean that the page is yellow. It would just mean that the thing that's most important is the yellow underline, right? So yellow pages get things done quicker, so fast you don't even need all the vowels. And then thinking about ... And I think this is also something that we talked earlier about, making sure that sometimes you can put in check the velocity of, Eurocentric or Western influence and make sure that the world is a much bigger place, and that also offers a much bigger palette and language and grammar by which to think about the moves that you can make. So the decision to put the pictorial mark on the right side of the word mark was thinking about smart home adoption in China. So am I privileging left to right reading, or can I look at right to left reading as a way to start to kind of balance how we're thinking about the flow of language, right? Because I can read this as dot, dot, the mark, or I can read the mark as dot, dot, and then dot, dot is the explanation of this Internet of Things technology, which was a layer of hardware, a layer of software, and two devices connecting over radio that made a little face. And then thinking about how did the tools, and I think this is really interesting. Bruce Mao talks about how design used to be opaque, and how the things that we were making were things that you couldn't see through, right? They could be posters, and the posters were essentially just compositions and surfaces of type and image. But as you started to being able to look through the poster as it became more transparent, you started to say, well, I'm actually looking at the total dimension of this company, right? Not just the poster and how they want me to think about them, but their actions, what I'm seeing in the news, what I'm seeing in social media. And you then start to think about the tools that you use to create these things. And so if dot dot was to be for the open Internet of Things, how do we think about using an open font license instead of a typeface that required an enterprise license? How can this live in GitHub in an open repository versus being at a gated, kind of brand portal? And then ultimately, how does this ladder up into the organization that's bringing forth the technology? And I think more and more, the tools are just another thing that we have to consider, how we're making something and by what means we're making something, as much as the final output or artifact. This was the introduction that I had to make for dot dot at CES, and I didn't have audio, and so I had to make something that was entirely visual, and assuming that people also weren't reading English as a first language, and so how to think about a purely visual story of a toaster trying to talk to a coffee maker, and once they get eyes, they get dot dotted, they can see each other and understand how to make the perfect coffee and toast that creates a better world. And then this becomes a little blinking face that you can look for inside of all of your now coordinated appliances that create, smarter homes, smarter neighborhoods, and ultimately smarter cities and worlds. And then thinking about how to, even extend this beyond just 2D graphics into, dimensional kind of experiences of, future prototypes of how we may or may not live with our EV inside of our photovoltaic shipping container home with our little kiddie pool. And then on to Uber. And I think, part of what the challenge was with Uber was working internally at a lot of their cultural issues, a lot of the ways in which they were actually treating each other, as much as there was a graphic embodiment of what their wrapper was going to be. And then thinking about how the world was seeing them at this inflection point of both their cultural moment, but also pre-IPO, when they're becoming a publicly traded company. There were some interesting tensions that we chose to see as opportunities between the ride side of the business, which was called Uber, and the eat side of the business, which was called Uber Eats, and specifically realizing that there were just simply ways in which you want to go and get things. And so if it's going and getting, which they've now embraced with Uber Go Get It, it's a strategy that ties it together as centered around the needs of a person, not the needs of a company. And the graphic signature of Uber was the U-frame, was the idea that, you could see this from a mile away, that it was the negative space that was the embrace around, the person, the food, or the logistics that truly communicated the intention of recommitting to the safety and well-being of the people within the ecosystem. And probably the proudest moment was this was the team in EMEA that did a Paris takeover of the metro, utilizing the U-frame probably better than I could have ever imagined for this out of home for Uber Pool. And then also, I think there was a unique twist for Uber was trying to design guidelines that were publicly facing. So similar to which was looking at the open Internet of Things, how do you design a brand guidelines that exists publicly that everybody can see, that everybody can go, oh, I can't believe that they have this type of clear space that they're doing this, but to have more of a conversation around how the system is working and functioning in complete transparency versus doing something that feels like it's secretive or or protected. And I think this is something that's shifting in terms of that that opaque quality that we talked about to something that's being more transparent. Sometimes I've had to design and think about with my teams things that haven't even been created yet. So like posters for an event that's 5 years from the present moment. So this is for Zymergen, which is a biofacturing company that applies machine learning to high throughput experimentation to create essentially biomanufactured goods versus relying on fossil fuels and plastics. From that exercise of playing with those forms and those rectangular kind of hinges within the Zymergen wordmark, it gave me the idea that when we were confronted with doing an emblem for Warner Media, that the secret might be in some similarly hinging mechanism. So Zymergen was the robotic arm that was inspiring the Z. This was inspired by the clapperboard. The idea that that's the one thing that when you say, action on set, that unifies all of the entities. And so then this just became the unlock for imagining, Warner Media, how the system could come together and how the colorways could suggest a theatrical moment of Black, the golden age of Hollywood, and ultimately white as a kind of an interactive space. So a little bit of sadness knowing that Warner Media is going to go away, but it was, again, you have to appreciate these journeys for what they provide, and not that these things are going to live on forever, but a moment to momentarily unify a lot of these different entities. And I have created this slide as something that I kind of go back to a lot, which is, well, so what does this all mean, or what are some of the learnings relative to how we can think about brand design, or even how companies are evolving. And I've thought a lot about how the word brand comes from the Norse word brandir, which means to burn, which means that branding initially starts off as territorial marking and ownership, right, and trademarking, and then goes on to casks and barrels, and then becomes an assurance of quality. And then I think branding moves through, let's say like these 5 ages, right? One is something is defined by the craft, how it is made, right? And so that's the waffle sole, right? So that's the texture in the background. That's we've never seen a sole like this before, right? Then there's the logo, right, or the symbol, right? What is the emblem or the mark that I can understand that it's Nike, but not Adidas and not Puma? But then ultimately, can you create an idea that is greater than the sum of all the products and services? Oh, well, maybe it's just do it. Maybe it's this idea of athletic empowerment that is what the whole company is striving towards, maybe never fully achieves. Then ultimately, how do you platform it? How do you take all these disparate ecosystems now that you've become, everything has become a technology company essentially, and think about Nike Plus and different ways in which Fuel and Nike ID and Nike Plus started to blur the lines between the different, kind of portfolio entities into more of a platform. And I think just lastly, to talk about Nike's efforts relative to circular design and that mark that's that pinwheel of swooshes, which is their mark of circular design, and their new line of, kind of space hippie shoes, which are looking at how trash can be treated as treasure. I think it's a very interesting kind of Mobius strip where you start to go into, how many waffles had to be made, and to how can we take trash and recycle it into shoes. And it just becomes, I think, the journey that a lot of companies are on in terms of moving through these various ages. But I've always liked to balance work that is for business entities or for profit with close collaborators that are working within the visual arts, whether it was Tavares Strawn and going to the North Pole. This was a project working closely with Titus Kaffar for a project called The Redaction. And Titus and Dwayne Betts, who is a poet, esteemed poet, the two of them decided to collaborate on a show that was looking how redaction could be explored on surface through obscuring and revealing, but then also through the creation of new language and poetry, redacting certain words to be able to change the way that you read it, to create a different type of meter. And so this was the project, and they asked me, could I provide a way to think about how typography could come into this conversation. So I partnered with Jeremy Mickle at Mickle Foundry, and we started to look at how typography is emblematic of the United States of America, and specifically the criminal justice system. And that does feel immediately like it's an overwhelming brief that you're giving yourself. But if we looked at, just the presidential seal, we see that the eagle talons are holding both an olive branch, which speaks to, I think, the tenderness in some moments of how justice is rendered, and the severity of the arrows and the other clutch talon. And this idea that typography could embrace the suppleness and roundedness in the forms of the olive branch, but also the severity of those sharp terminals. And then it was neither one or the other, but that they both were there and emblematic of what we mean by the United States. And so we started to look at the two typefaces that are required for any legal briefs in the United States, both at a kind of a circuit level and also at a Supreme Court level. So it's Times New Roman and Century School Book. And so we created a hybrid of those two typefaces, and then created the hyper sharpening, and then also anticipating a lot of these redacted documents are ones that pass through photocopiers and fax machines. And so they experience a sense of degradation, but that degradation is actually content. It means this is not the original document. And so how can degradation become part of this, visual language? And here you see the United States of America going through a state of its pristine state at the top to this degraded state at the bottom. And then ultimately this is, redaction in the wild. We were completely touched that Titus and Dwayne started to utilize redaction in the prints themselves, completely bowled us over when we went to the exhibit at MoMA PS1, that the typography was featured so prominently in the work. And I think we realized that that's because we, I think, took the brief as seriously as they did in terms of what redaction could compel us to create through our professional vehicle, which was type design. And then they decided to make it open source. And one of the most amazing things about making something open source is seeing what the world does with what you've created. So, Steve Horton Jr. Created the Black Justice flag. We have a variety of posters. Jerome Harris got this tattooed on his arm. I had some of my former students at CCA create posters and memos. And then this is still the site, it's still up. You can go to redaction.us, and it has a little bit of the story about how we created this typeface for those that are interested. And you can also download the typeface and use it. You should feel so inclined. So what about the future? What does all this mean? I shared a bunch of material. Hopefully, the presentation shows a combination of very visible, high exposure work, but it's all grounded in something that's very personal. And hopefully that's the true through line, is that your own lived experience, your own ways in which you see the world, even ways that you second guess at times that you think are strange and bizarre, are ultimately the actual keys to create the unlock for you to be able to have a practice and a methodology by which you can approach any brief, from a telephone company to a car company to a painter or a sculptor, in a way that makes you feel centered in your own process, so you don't lose yourself amidst the turbulence of the brief. So Alan Kay said famously that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And he was actually one of my mom's colleagues at Atari Cambridge Research Laboratory, which is cool that I get to quote him in here and give him a shout out. Oftentimes I'm asked for advice, and it's one of those things that I always like to reflect on things that I wish somebody would have told me earlier in my career that I had to learn the hard way. And usually the school of hard knocks is the only way that you learn something is when something is truly painful, you would truly never do it again. But I always think that for any engagement, it's important to ask a question, which is the person I'm going to be collaborating with deeply and authentically, do they have the same level of taste that I have? We'll be able to complete each other's sentences relative to cultural references, typographic references, art direction references, filmic references. Great. If so, proceed, right? Maybe a lot of opinions, and it may be that you might have a hard time getting anything done, but taste provides a commonality in a shorthand. Or if you don't feel that there's a commonality relative to how you're seeing the world, that's also fine as long as the collaborator trusts that you are the expert in your particular domain, because it means that they can focus on what they do best and that they're trusting you to do what you do best, and you meet in the middle and it becomes a true partnership. But if you do not feel taste or trust, I would advise you to leave because some of my worst engagements are when the taste level wasn't there, but the trust level also wasn't there. And that's when you get into, I showed this to my brother and I showed this to my friend and my neighbor. And that's when you get into those bizarre Bermuda triangles of engagements that you can avoid. So taste, trust, leave, words of wisdom. Some people ask a lot of times, how do you get your work in the world? You've been on these like giant televisions and you've done all this stuff. And it's a really quite simple, but it's often overlooked, which is there are 3 gates to your work being in the world. Most likely, most people are only thinking about one, which is I need to do like a Don Draper in the room and like drop the mic, and they go, yes, that's exactly what we're looking for. And that's like nice if you're Don Draper, but most likely for a lot of us, it takes us a while before we're ready for the big conference room, or the big meeting room, or the big Zoom, or whatever it is. How do you convince your own team that this is an exciting idea? How do you listen to understand what your own teammates think is great design so that you can understand how you can communicate to them that this is an idea that we could put forward and that we could all feel really good about putting this idea forward? So the first gate is your own team, right? It's not the client. Forget about the client. Your first client is actually your team, because your team has to be able to see that your idea is redeemable. The second one, of course, is the second gate, which is the presentation of an idea that feels pragmatic, feels emotional, feels right and authentic to the brief. That's the second gate. The third gate that everyone forgets about is the most important gate, is there will be a client that you will never present to, that your client will have to present to away from you, that will actually approve the process. And because you don't have access to that client, this is the most difficult gate to master, which means in the way in which you present to the second gate has to be replicable for that person to present to someone else. You have to essentially give them the story that is bite-sized enough for them to be able to successfully sell that in up the chain. And I think one of the things to ask yourself is, what's the relationship that you want to have to your work? Do you want to have intimate control over the details, the minutia, the qualities of the paper, the exact, kind of typographic, kerning of the letters? And that's important and totally valid. Or is it that you want to see your work at scale? And by seeing your work at scale and being in conversation with other work that's also at scale, do you understand it in a better context than if something was maybe in a more rarefied audience? And there's no right answer. It's just a question to understand how you start to pursue certain opportunities relative to the relationship that you want to have with your work. Are the qualities of your work that you feel most inspired by things that are visible to other people? Like they can actually see them, touch them, they're palpable expressions? Are they actually invisible? And it's okay that they're invisible, but the way in which your design works means that something is just a little bit easier for somebody to understand, to use, to feel a sense of belonging. Both are completely valid, but invisible is just as valid as visible. And I'm often asked between kind of hard, technical skills and soft skills, like what is the kind of the balance of the ratio? And this is the most terrifying slide, but if I was to be perfectly honest, I would say that 97% of design is soft skills relative to getting something understood, approved, seen, navigated in the world, discussed, brought in your audience. I think there are a lot of people that have tremendous hard and technical skills that can do anything with shortcuts and keys. And I do think that this is not to invalidate the development and the sincere development of your skill set, but don't undervalue the ability to understand how to communicate with other people and how to understand what keeps someone up at night that may be completely different, and how do you bridge those lanes of communication so that your work can be seen in the world. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Wow. That was incredible. Thank you. Okay. So I have questions, but I would love for us to add questions in the chat. Maybe I'll start the questions, but please feel free to use the chat, and then we can call on you guys and you can unmute yourself and directly ask your question to Forrest. But yeah, that was incredible. I was really sort of thinking about that through line of the pixel in your work, and sort of your kind of recognition of that through line. And I was curious if that was something that you noticed as you were working on projects maybe throughout the years, or was it like an intentional observation of your work as like a reflection or retrospective kind of analysis of your work? And if it was more of like an analysis of your work that you began to notice this, do you think that's important for other artists and designers to do?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I'd be absolutely lying if I said that I was absolutely aware of it. I think this is one of those moments where I think it's an incredible privilege to ever speak to anyone about your work. And I think that you have to be as authentic and sincere about the work. And I would say that my only kind of apologies for presenting so much finished work. I always am highly skeptical of decks that have lots of finished products, and there was of course messiness and lots of tripwires involved in all of them. But I would say that in reflecting on it, I think we're all trying to make sense of why we do the things that we do.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand. One, in terms of what do you want to do more of and what do you want to do less of? When I realized that in the work that I was most proud of, there was a certain quality of how I was navigating that formal challenge that related to something that fundamentally I was exposed to, when I was 5 years old. Now, when I was doing it, I don't think I was, completely asleep at the wheel, but I certainly wasn't recalling it vividly. But I do think it's important to every moment, pull back and pause and say, what work felt the most effortless or fun? What work felt grueling? What work am I most proud of? And ultimately, what are the kind of formal qualities of these things? And are there any things that, are in this kind of center of gravity from inspiration or people? And, it's interesting. There was a guy who was a very controversial figure at Yale named Harold Bloom. He talked a lot about the anxiety of influence. And he said that artists who are not aware of other great artists, or maybe who never kind of have the courage to confront their own influences, will always be echoes of great artists. So Picasso was obsessed with Velázquez because he believed that Velázquez might be a better painter than he was. And so he had to outpaint Velázquez. He did something like 29 versions of Las Meninas. Like he did like so many paintings of that painting until he felt he had confronted Velasquez. James Joyce does that with Homer and Ulysses. And I think it's interesting to just think about the very almost violent act of the very reason of why you do what you do. You may have to confront and challenge to be able to negotiate form on your own terms, which was a very eye-opening thought relative to how can I be my own kind of fully autonomous maker, not masking in the light of another artist as much as I may feel a certain kinship with them. So I think to your point, that was, I guess, an excessive build, Kalina, but I think that it's probably analysis looking backwards, but also trying to clarify, am I just drafting off of someone, or am I actually making stuff that feels uniquely myself?
Yeah, I think thank you for that. And you sort of gave several reminders throughout that, our own voice, our own experience has value and is worth that investigation. And that's certainly something that, I've discovered, in my own work as well. But I think it gives us confidence to be true to who we are and use our identity and our stories, especially when we don't really see it in sometimes the books that we're studying from or the other work that's out there. We sort of have to do that our own investigative work, so, okay, thank you for that. Are you guys able to turn your, I know there was an issue with the videos not being able to be turned on. Were you able to fix that, Courtney, or I don't know?
I think so.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think a couple of people were able to turn it on. I would love any other questions if you have. Oh, there we go. Sorry if you were trying to turn it on earlier and you couldn't do that. We didn't realize that was, on there. But if you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask away. Oh, David put one in the chat. You can unmute if you can, or maybe you can't. Let's see. Ask to unmute. There we go.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, friends.
Hey there, recognize as Raptors.
So how does materiality play into your current practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that one of the things that, it may be another subtle thing similar to the pixel is kind of early exposure to, animation and time-based media kind of gave me this idea that whenever I was thinking about making some type of form, I was actually imagining it as some type of machine. So when I was thinking about Zymergen, I was thinking about the robotic arm and the movements of those two henches. When I was thinking about Warner Media, I was thinking about the clapperboard and that kinetic movement of the action clap. When I was thinking about, Tavares flag, it was literally a flag and how a flag exists and how it moves. And I think that materiality is incredibly important. I think that it allowed me to think of and to anticipate how something could move and how the movement of something is indicative of something's spirit as much as something is as a reductive, static emblem. And I think that's going to be even more important as we get into the world of everything is moving all the time, is how something moves, communicates a value, it communicates a gestural quality. And I think that materiality starts to dictate, well, is it bubblegum? Is it fluid? Is it flubber? Is it rigid? Is it staccato? Is it flow? So I think that materiality is kind of baked into that consideration of how is something machined, and ultimately, how does it express itself over time?
Would anyone else like to unmute or ask? Angela, did you? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Colleen. Yeah, I'm polling the room and requesting questions. So I think we may formulate one or two, but yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to Forrest, incredible presentation. I think there's a lot of turning wheels that I see. So yeah, thank you.
And Angela's at Lipscomb University, and she has her class. Is that your graphic design class? Or what's the?
Yes, this is typography 1,
Okay.
first level.
All right, I'll ask another question while you guys are thinking. So you said 97% of design is soft skills. So where do you suggest the students, develop those soft skills? Is it through, where? Is it through work? Is it through school? Is it, where does that sort of develop and build? And does it take time sort of to harness those skills?
It's a really great question. I remember Emily Oberman once was talking about how Tibor Kalman used to sell in very almost impossible to sell ideas to clients. And she said that he kind of like revealed his like secret of like how he would sell something. And I literally felt like when I heard this, it was like the sky opened and there was like a nugget of wisdom that just came down from the heavens. And he would say that if you want someone to accept the idea of a red ball, the worst thing that you can do is present a red ball. Because the first question that someone will ask when you present a red ball is, why is it red? Why is it a ball? My favorite color is purple, and I love cubes. And immediately the solution, it just evaporates. But he would say, if you were able to take the red ball and you were able to separate it into its most irreducible components, it's the idea of red and the idea of a sphere. So in your presentation, if you were to say, when we were thinking about all of the colors that we could choose from the somber, melancholic qualities of blue to the vivid qualities of a violet, we came back to the passion and the excitation and the love inherent in this color red. We looked at a shape that we felt was most humanizing of our company. We thought back to the astronauts who were standing on the lunar surface looking back at the pale blue dot and going, that sphere, that pale blue dot, that's what we call home. And in that moment, the person who is listening to that exposition will actually fuse together those two ideas of red and sphere, and they will actually, in their mind's eye, see a red ball. And oftentimes they will propose to you, I know it's a red ball, that's what we got to do. And you go, that's amazing, because the next slide is a red ball. So those are more mechanics of, it's very difficult to communicate ideas. It's very difficult to communicate a very progressive idea, especially if somebody has assumptions of what that solution should look like, as much as they're engaging you to come up with it. So you have to find a way to bridge so that they feel like they're arriving at it themselves, even if that's couldn't be farther from the truth. To answer your earliest question, I think that theater or acting or some improvisational course can be extremely helpful. Ultimately, when you present, it can feel like you're auditioning. And the worst thing you can do when you're auditioning is feeling like you're like trying out and you're being judged. Like you're saying, am I worthy or not? But the right way to think about an audition is, I have a gift and I am going to present this gift to you. And it is going to be great. And if you can't appreciate this gift, I will take this gift elsewhere. Those ideas inherent in theater and how you engage a person in your scene or even an improvisational moment are incredibly helpful. And I think people will be surprised if you do an improv class, if you do an intro to scene study, the parallels between design and theater. You look at a great poster has a very communicative intent of what it's trying to do. And there's no confusion about what it's trying to say or do or point you to. Or if it is confusing, it's extremely confusing and frustrating, and then it does what it's trying to do. In the same way that an actor can have a beat on stage. And so I would encourage folks, because you don't want to have the moment of learning too hard and too difficult of a threshold in the room itself with the client. You want to be able to build that muscle over time and to be able to have those awkward moments and those, oh, I can't believe I said that, but to get more comfortable just being loose with other people, so that when you do get to the room, you know, you can feel like you have a better sense of staying grounded, how to breathe, and then how to focus.
Thank you. That was good. And I'm making a note to sign up for an improv class now. But no, I think that's very true in storytelling. And I think about how that relates to writing as well, and just being able to, you know, kind of take someone, you know, through a story and get them to kind of understand what it is that you're wanting them to understand, and through all types of you know, creative work as well, you know, outside of design. Lakeisha, did you, or Cynthia, or I don't know who else was here. Did you guys have a question? I know we're a little bit over time, but we have time maybe for like one other question if anyone wants to throw it out there. There's Sam. Oh, awesome.
How you doing? I do have a question, and then I'm going to try my best not to make it strange and all of that. But as I was listening and watching, I couldn't help but to kind of connect to the idea of what designers and on broader scope creatives think of, and how we sort of engage and gain influence from the world and so on and so forth. And I couldn't help but to ask the question of, in your own career and how you would engage with students, would you say that what would be better to give a student the ability to see how to solve problems, or to create solutions? And I know that sounds very similar, but in my head, I'm thinking of how one sees the world, and would it be better to become reactive to the things that you see, or be in the studio and become kind of proactive to, I mean, just work and then see how the things that you work on have some connection to the outer world. So I don't know if that's, if you're.
No, it's a great question. I would say that this current moment it's never been more difficult and exciting to be a designer at the same time. Difficulty going way, way up, excitement going way, way up. Why is that? It's because the people that we are working with, collaborating with, have such an elevated design sensibility that 10, 15 years ago, if you were to walk into a room and say, you know, the typeface that we chose for you is going to be Gotham bold, they go, oh, Gotham, it sounds like a great idea. The client today will have a specific idea of the exact typeface that they're in love with, the spread from Cosmo that they were looking at that they think we should copy. And you almost then have to then react in space and in the moment on your feet to stave off like an assumptive solution that's being hurled at you with maximum velocity in a way that you can accept it, embrace it, complement their astute observations of typography in the world. But ultimately, you're there to provide a great solution. But in order to provide that great solution, you need to be able to proactively have an idea about how you're going to react. Right? And to assume there might be an incredibly high level of maturity, design maturity, maybe like tremendous from your collaborator. I think that oftentimes we are growing into or anticipating for many of the students roles that don't even exist. So like it's impossible for you to prepare technically for a role that doesn't exist. What you can prepare for is understanding yourself, who you are, what inspires you, Is there a particular way in which you enjoy making things and see the world? And then you want to move closer to those things that feel supportive, where you feel like you belong and you feel nourished. Then at that point, when someone says, here's a Figma document, all right, we need a 20-page deck. And you're like, Figma? I just finished learning InDesign. Now I have to learn Figma. And then it's like, oh, so it's just kind of like, just like flow into it, because I'm confident that I know how to solve it because I've solved things before, but I'm not thrown from somebody switching the tools on me. And I think that's an incredibly important thing that's only going to get choppier, but also at the same time more exciting, because I think designers are being more appreciated than they ever have before. But part of that appreciation is also a lot of people who want to be designers with you. I don't know, Sam, did that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, it does. And I mean, I just wanted to say I'm awed by the simplicity of the complexity that goes into making something simple. I mean, and the grasp that you have on that is absolutely amazing. So I appreciate you taking time to speak with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I want to respect your time for us. Angela, I didn't know if your class had a question or not. Did you guys decide on that? Or were you guys good?
I'll unmute. Would anyone like to ask a final question? Okay. I have a taker.
Okay. All right.
Hello. I just had a real quick question. I heard, I saw that a lot of your stuff had motion graphics in it. I was just wondering, how do you go about like tackling, navigating that in a sense of seeing like where that's going to go, and just with the technology as a whole in general, because I know that's a lot of what we're moving towards as well. So I was just wondering about your process of that.
So I'm going to do a long answer because it's a really great question. I'm glad that you asked this. There's a certain point as a design student where we're like, are you kidding me? How many 10,000 things do I have to learn? I have to learn software. I have to learn how to animate, and I have to learn how to code. I have to learn how to tap dance. It's like, what more can I do as a designer? I can't do any more than I already am doing. I once stumbled into an acting class, again, another acting class metaphor, and they were trying to understand what they were calling, as a class was called 5 Rhythms. And it was how you could understand and appreciate the rhythms of like a scene. So is a scene like staccato and like, boop, 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 or is it like flow and like Tai Chi, or is it like stillness and like no one's moving at all? Or is it like it's like chaotic? Or is it like lyrical and like boop, boop, tag, you're it? And what's fascinating about it was that these 5 rhythms, like they would play songs and they'd go, oh, Kung Fu fighting, staccato. Like, oh, bridge over troubled water, that's flow. Like it was like you could perceive the rhythm. And what I realized is that you can kind of understand, you can intuit what is the rhythm that something wants to be. You may not understand technically how to drop boards and how to think about a specific motion design workflow, but you'll be like, this is kind of like a slinky, and give yourself permission to make weird sounds and to completely embarrass yourself like that, because animators love it when you commit to that kind of thing, because they go, oh, I look at those weird references all the time. So what's the rhythm that something wants to be? You'll probably have a good sense of that. Now, how to animate it, what other animations or movements or gestures, fit into that rhythm? You can go on YouTube, you can find clips of, is it a murmuration of swallows and how they swarm, like School of Fish and how they turn? Is it more like a slinky? Is it more like precise and fluid and mechanical? Is it elastic? Is it more like a metronome? And the more that you become comfortable with your own references, you'll develop ways to be able to communicate with other people whose expertise is motion, or you develop that as an additional skill set. And the last piece of advice I'll ever give, when you're giving a presentation about your work, and specifically if you may be like nailing the presentation everybody in the audience looks like they're in extreme pain. And I say this, if the audience is laughing and smiling and nodding, they're not actually taking in information. But if they're truly thinking, people's faces look terrifying when you're presenting. And just remember that. Work for the terrified face, and then you know that you've succeeded. But don't be thrown by it, because it will happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Forrest. We really appreciate you being here, and seriously that you chose to spend your time with us. You know, we have begun this artist talk series during the pandemic and the continued pandemic. And it's been a wonderful way for our students to, and our community, you know, our local university students as well, to engage with artists and designers, and to learn through their methodologies and their experiences and, you know, their successes and failures. And so we appreciate, you know, the advice and the time. So yeah, I think we'll stop there. Courtney, did you?
I'm just going to do a shout out for our next art talk, which is next week, and it's Art Sims. And if you don't know who Art Sims is, right? Thanks, Forrest. You better go look him up right now, because you need to get some learning in. And I think that'll be, next week, Thursday at 2:30. And I dropped the link so you can register in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. And thank you guys for attending. We appreciate you guys.